Okay, now we've had a very fine lecture from Maria Elena Solino, and we've seen the rich culture of Spain and the Spanish influences on medieval Europe, and maybe we could focus on this. Philosophy, music, literature, and I've added architecture here. Actually, there are some Islamic influences on medieval architecture, and I put this down because we're going to find out more about the architecture next week when we have Nora Laus lecturing on medieval architecture. I wanted to tell you that I've put on our website a list of the architectural terms that she uses in that lecture so that you can look at them and have them in front of you when she actually gives the lecture. Look at that list before her lecture and look up any terms you don't know in the glossary that's in your readings book. And you might want to have that glossary in front of you when she gives that lecture because she uses a lot of technical terms. Well, now we're going to turn to the literature of Spain's neighbor, medieval France. And we last looked at medieval France in about 1000, and here it is split up into essentially the kingdoms of the grandchildren of Charlemagne, and we can see it breaking up into very small component parts just before the year 1000. Remember that France was different from England and Germany because it did break up into local units of government. And now we're going to have Richard Armstrong, who happens to be the husband of Maria Elena Solino, so it's a family night tonight. And Richard is in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages. He's assistant professor of classics. He got his BA in Latin, was it, Richard?
Classical and Romance philology.
Classical and Roman literature at the University of Chicago, and he also finished up at Yale University for his MA and PhD. He now teaches Latin, Greek, and medieval literature, especially medieval poetry, at the University of Houston, and he's going to speak to us tonight on courtly love in medieval French literature.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I want to start by basically giving you a fact. It was sometime around the beginning of the 12th century in the south of France, people began to write love songs in their own language. And being an intelligent audience, you will naturally say, big deal. After all, if you turn on your car radio, you can hear hundreds, thousands probably of love songs, lots of people saying, ooh, baby, baby, and this doesn't seem to be an earth-shattering thing. Well, I guess if I had to think about what my task will be tonight, it's going to be to try and teach you why this is important, why love poetry, beginning around the 12th century again, in the south of France in particular, although we'll also talk a bit about northern France, is actually rather earth-shattering and important for the history of poetry as well as the history of music. And I'm going to do this by basically taking 3 steps. First of all, we need to see a bit about what we mean by French literature, because curiously enough, a lot of what I'll talk about tonight was not really written in French. So linguistically we have some issues, culturally we have some issues to raise there, simply in defining what French literary culture is in the Middle Ages. So then we'll move on for the bulk of tonight's lecture, to talk about the origins of this poetry in the troubadour poetry of southern France. And again, we're going to spend an awful lot of this lecture mostly there. But at the end, I will move north and talk about further developments of not just love poetry, but also different types of discourse involving this fascination with love, or courtly love as we know it. So we'll get into a discussion of the art of love, or the arts of love, that is manuals about how to love, and also the turn to narrative, that is telling stories that are in some sense focused on issues and problems that have to do with love. So, for lovers only tonight. French medieval literature. It sounds like an obvious topic, but it's not. First of all, it's not all in French. I just told you that, right? This is something that I think we might first of all look at this map here to give you some idea. If you look at these chief feudal districts, as it's called here, you'll see it's a rather motley patchwork. It looks kind of like a quilt. And in fact, this just underlies the important notion that I'm going to talk about linguistically in a moment, which is there's effectively no context of a national culture. We think of France today as a very unified country, a very centralized country centered on Paris, with this wonderful language academy that tries to outlaw the use of certain English words. They failed to do that. But the fact of the matter is we think of France as having one of the most centralized cultures in Europe. But in medieval France, it was not at all like that. It was, in fact, this motley assortment of some, especially in the south, very large fiefs, but much smaller ones sprinkled throughout. And as I think you can see here, this area around the city of Paris, which is very important for the development of French culture, is rather tiny compared to, let's say, Brittany or Normandy, places like that. So that geographical reality is also going to be reflected linguistically. And let's talk a bit about this very important language, which has various names. It's called Occitan these days. Mostly it's called that. It's called Provençal. It's also referred to as the langue d'oc, which literally means the language of oc, meaning yes. Strange way to refer to it, but in fact a very common way to refer to it. What is this? It is not a dialect of French. It would be very naughty for you to say that it is a dialect of French, because in fact it is a separate Romance language in the Middle Ages, in fact, beginning at, again, towards the beginning of the 12th century. It could easily compete with any other Romance language on its own. So this is an independent cultural medium, if you will. It still exists, although it lost considerably in the political game in the unification of France and is now considered a minority language. But again, it is a separate Romance language, and you'll have a chance to hear it later tonight. If that sort of thing amuses you, you might want to stay awake for it. Now, even if we go north, we'll find that there is no unified French language in the north. Again, what unifies a language is a long process of nationalization. And the langue d'huile, which is what we call the northern French language, the language of huile, which is how they used to say yes, and oc was how they said yes in the south, that's the simple division that they developed, is divided into a number of dialects which are competing for ascendancy. Just to give you an example, Francien is the specific dialect from the area around the Île-de-France, again around Paris. This is what is going to develop into the national language. But in the 12th century, we don't know that. What we know is there are other very powerful dialects, noticeably the dialect of Normandy, again, where the Dukes of Normandy come from, who I hope you've learned in 1066 conquer England and spread this language all over England, at least for the aristocracy. But also in this general area here, a bit farther east, we have a very important dialect Picard, where in the cities, especially the culture of the cities, which is very interesting and very different from the great courts in the south and the royal court around the Île-de-France, that will develop into an important language, especially for drama, but is also used for lyric poetry. So all of this is simply to give you an impression that when we talk about medieval French literature, we really have to say French literature with little bunny rabbits, because it's not French in the sense that we think of France today and French culture. There's also, over here in Brittany, if I can point to that, on this little peninsula standing out, a Celtic fringe to France, which still exists today. And that was a peninsula that during the Anglo-Saxon invasions of England was repopulated by fleeing Celts who came from England and brought with them their language and traditions. And throughout the 12th century, these very mysterious and rather ancient stories are sort of put into the pipeline of mainstream French culture and lead to one of the most exciting and interesting developments in medieval French literature, things like the development of the stories of Tristan and also King Arthur. So that's a very important conduit then for the development of northern French culture, and one which will become internationally very important. Breton then is that language, the Celtic language again, from that little French element. Lastly, well, not lastly actually, we have to consider the importance of Latin. Some of the most important things that are being written in France are being written in Latin, which remains the great international language and the language of high culture. And Paris, the University of Paris, rather, is one of the great intellectual centers of the world. So you have to consider then that an awful lot of what's going on in France and going on in Latin is really also major and quite important. Unfortunately, it's for a more limited clientele, you might say. Mostly male, mostly people who are in some way connected with the church. But Latin literacy is the first literacy on the scene, and vernacular literacy, or again, literacy in these other languages, only comes later. And lastly, have you just heard about the wonders of medieval Spain? You need to know also that we should also put down Hebrew as an important language for medieval France, because in fact there are large Jewish communities in the south of France and also in the north. And one of the greatest biblical commentators in the medieval Jewish tradition, Rashi, is in fact from northern France. He was born in Troyes. You have his dates there, 1040 to 1105. And interestingly enough, in his commentaries in the Bible, occasionally he would break into French to explain something to a student, and then they would write it in Hebrew characters, but in French, very oddly. And that's one way in which we can reconstruct the pronunciation of medieval French from this Hebrew transliteration. So, as motley as the map is, then you see we have an enormous multicultural and multilinguistic context in which to begin to talk about French literature. Didn't you hope it was probably easier than that? Well, it's not. Now, let me complicate it further. When we think of medieval French culture expressed in one of the languages of medieval France, it's not all taking place in France, what we think of as France today. First of all, again, after 1066, this important connection between France and England leads to, in part, in the aristocracy, the development of a dialect called Anglo-Norman. Again, the Norman French spoken by those living in England. And that becomes quite important for reasons that at the end of the lecture I think you'll understand quite readily. But also northern Italy, there are courts there in which we find a bizarre Franco-Italian literature. It's kind of a mixture of the two languages, kind of macaronic and strange. But also we find plenty of people in Italy who choose to write in French, and their French can often be quite good, including, by the way, Marco Polo, whose famous world travels were written down first in French. Another fellow by the name of Brunetto Latini, his name's not important, but he writes a very famous encyclopedia in Italy. He was Dante's teacher, and he wrote it in French because it was considered to be the international vernacular language. So that goes to show you that even in beyond France, there is a production of things in French. Now, you've just heard a lot about Spain, and one thing that you should know is south of the Pyrenees, especially in Catalonia, that's in the region of northeastern Spain, this actually has, to this day, its own language, Catalan, which is a sister language to Provençal. And these are sister cultures who have been politically, throughout the Middle Ages, very closely linked and feel a natural affinity with one another. Also, the kings of Aragon and Castile love troubadouric poetry, and there are plenty of southern French poets in these courts. So again, there's a diffusion throughout here and a production also in those courts going on. So it's very messy indeed. Last thing I'll tell you is that when you talk about France, especially calling someone a Français, what you really mean in the Middle Ages is that they are from the Ile-de-France. Again, this tiny little area here in the center of the map. It's a bit like how we use the word Yankee. If you're abroad, someone calls you a Yankee, it means you're an American. If you're here and someone calls you a Yankee, it means you're from the North. And if you're from the North and someone calls you a Yankee, it means you're from New England. So it gets more and more precise the closer you get to its source. So, the bottom line is this. We're talking about, when we talk about the literatures, I guess we have to say, of medieval France, the most important vernacular literature in Western Europe. Hands down. All right? That's why you have to care about this. The influences of this literature are far and wide. Just to give you a few examples, to give you some notion of the phenomenon. Spain, for example, well into the 15th century, when people in Italy are already getting started with the Renaissance, Spain sees a troubadouric revival, which again takes back all the way to the 12th century and in the early 13th century, these forms of poetry. So that goes to show there's a remarkable backlash there going on. In Italy, the great poets of the 14th century, like Dante and Petrarch, look back again to the 12th century, to these poets, especially in Occitan or in Provençal, as being the founders of their own tradition, because they know very well Italian literature, which starts a bit later in the 13th century, especially the poetry that is going to be of the kind I'm showing today. They know very well that it begins by imitating Provençal models. And in fact, in a very interesting passage in Dante's Purgatory, there's one poet of all the foreigners in the Divine Comedy who speaks his own language, and that is the Provençal poet Arnaud Daniel, who speaks Provençal verses in the middle of this Italian poem that Dante wrote himself. That's just to show you how dramatically they feel the connection to this tradition. In Germany, there also is a powerful influence of this poetry that leads to a long tradition of Minnesänger or love singers. Again, a poetry that is very similar, very complex, and later takes off on its own. And in England, again, I can just show you this map. I think you've seen this before, is that right? This is in the time of Henry II. You can see it's very difficult to extricate, given the fact that, again, these domains are held by the King of England, what is the difference between English and French culture, because the aristocracy, again, in both countries share a common culture and language, and of course here just the very nature of the Plantagenet sort of dominions defies characterization as either English or French. Also, it is often said no English speaker can talk about culture without speaking French. And again, this is the dramatic linguistic fact that so much of our language of culture and refinement is directly taken from the Norman French of the conquest. Again, just think of court, courtesy, courtly, courteous. All these words that we tend to think of now as just normal words come particularly from this area and reflect in a way the ideology I'll talk about today. Lastly, if you want to see the far extreme of all this, you can find the influence of French literature as far and wide as Iceland, and in the Eastern Mediterranean, the island of Cyprus, and in the Crusader kingdom. So again, this is a remarkably important literature, and I hope, first of all, that I'm not talking too fast for you, but also that you can understand why. This is not just any love poetry, or not just any literature. All right? Now, let's go to the south of France to talk about southern French, and now I will say southern French culture, because again, obviously, to the extent that this is considered French is something we just created a problem out of. What we're talking about happens from around 1100 and reaches its height, stopping somewhere at the beginning of the 13th century with an event known as the Albigensian Crusades. What happened was, in the south of France, as well as love poetry, there was a great flowering of heresy. A particular heresy I'll talk about a little bit more later. This was a provocation which the Pope sought to essentially put an end to by calling for a crusade inside France. And the consequence was, it's a bit like asking a bunch of bikers to enforce the law. You can imagine that the group that got together was rather rowdy. The wars that were started there were rather bloody, and in fact, the consequence of this, especially at the end of the first sort of period of these crusades in 1229, is virtually the destruction of this precocious culture of southern France. It's not entirely annihilated, but it is seriously hampered and weakened. A lot of the poets run off to places like northern Italy and Spain. Okay? But it does eke out an existence, and the outer limit of it in production, again, is somewhere around 1350. So it does kind of trickle on thereafter, but in much weakened form. Now, we're talking about 460 poets with over 2,500 extant songs. Again, these are songs, of which only about 250 of the melodies survive. And what that means then is it's a huge amount of poetry, really. It doesn't look like so much maybe when you first look at it. But in point of fact, if you compare it with any other sector, let's say, in the Norton Anthology of Literature, that's a lot of poetry. And it seems to come out of nowhere. This is what we have to talk about a little bit later on in this section. Where does this come from? How is this happening? The other thing I wanted to say is that these poets come from all walks of life. Some of them are the greatest nobles in the land. Some of the later poets in northern France will even be kings. Some of them, however, are basically minstrels who take to actually composing themselves, and they have stage names like Cercamon, which means globetrotter. Some of them are actually technically in orders. There's one who's even a monk, who's fairly well known. And they show a great variety in what they're writing about. However, over half of these poems express what we call courtly love, or what I'm going to start calling fin amour. All right, that's in actual Provençal. Fin amour means something like true love, in the sense that finor is true gold, that is, 100% real, true love. It also means a love that is refined. There are all sorts of nuances in this terminology, and we'll get through them in a minute. All right? So fin amour, or courtly love, is the dominant theme by far in this poetry. Now again, this is lyric poetry, which means originally, again, songs, and it's very important for you to realize that. It's only recently, in the last 15 years, that there's been an explosion in the recording of these as songs, and I would encourage you to actually try and listen to these, because it's much more interesting. It's the way in which they were originally received. They were not read, they were not published as books. They were performed and heard, and they caught on as songs. In that sense, they're just like the love songs you hear on the radio. And they became an international sensation, again, as songs. So it's a bit like the spread of rock and roll worldwide, which also helped the cause of the English language, as you may know. It's very hard to sing rock and roll in German, for example. So you have to think of this as, again, both a musical and a poetic dimension. Unfortunately, I can't sing these things for you tonight. And of course, copyrights on recordings are rather grisly, so you'll just have to take it for granted. Again, part of what makes this fascinating is this is in a vernacular language. That means not Latin. It is considered, again, even by their own poets, as inferior in some sense to the great Latin language and its literary tradition and its apparent grammatical rationality. And one of the things that happens in this vernacular literature, rather interestingly, is because of this built-in inferiority complex, being just the vernacular, they create a sense of form. They create a sense of complexity that's bewildering. Unfortunately, you have to know the language to appreciate it. But one of the things about this whole corpus of poetry that's striking is their deep love of complexity. And part of that comes from, again, the sense of challenge. If this is going to be real poetry, we've got to be at least as good as Latin. Now, this is composed by someone who is typically called a troubadour, which our word troubadour comes from that, and that means composer of both words and music. All right? They're very proud of the fact that they are composers. I had a picture here, but I think I've lost it. Yes, I think I did. At any rate, there are female poets, poetesses, if you will, some people think that's a bad word, called troubadours. And these women are almost all noble women, so you don't get, washing women doing this sort of thing. But there are female poets who do this, and it's quite interesting to read their work as well. Unfortunately, I can't spend quite enough time on them, but again, you need to know that this goes both ways in terms of gender. Trobar, where the word troubadour comes from, means to compose, again. So the sense of being a creator, a composer, is very strong in this, and it comes through in the poetry as well, an enormous pride of craftsmanship, as well as the fact that this is not anonymous poetry. Again, a lot of the very earliest poetry that survives is largely anonymous, but this type of poetry is really marked by the fact that authorship is a large part of it. So, this poetry initially, again, was composed, most likely also performed by the original author, but then circulates, especially farther out, in performance by a person often known as a joglar. He's a professional minstrel, professional performer of much lower social status. It's where our word juggler comes from, so you can kind of tell the status of this sort of person. And I don't know, we might show you, these are things taken off of manuscript illustrations. You can get some idea of, this is supposedly a ballad singer. He's got this sort of proto-violin that he's playing. Again, other musicians here, these are Minnesingers from Germany, but again, you can get a sense for the performative environment. These are not people reading books about poetry, or of poetry rather, but again, people who are hearing performances and who are performing. Now, I guess that's one thing I might clarify again. This is a poetry that does use writing because it's complex, it needs to be composed that way, but it's received, again, aurally, that is to say, by the ears. In the north, the similar terms for troubadour, again, is trouvère, and again, for joglar, jongleur. So these are just the northern Longueville versions of the same. You can see they're very close. All right? What are basic notions here? The first and most surprising, in a way, if you know anything about especially the love poetry of antiquity, not ancient philosophy, but ancient love poetry, is the idea that love is basically ennobling or refining. Love makes you, in some sense, better. That's a fundamental idea that you really have to unpack at great length through this poetry, because it's not as nice as it sounds. Love is a miserable experience you'll find in this poetry, rather scary, rather unpleasant at times, but that it is a fundamental challenge in the discovery of who you are, and again, is your ultimate source of happiness in many ways. And this is why it puts it in sort of dangerous competition with certain religious values that we'll talk about as we go along here. Again, in antiquity, one often gets the notion that love is almost tragic in import. It can be kind of a punishment, as it often is in tragedy. A goddess decides to screw up your life, so she makes you fall in love with someone. And in Roman love poetry, again, there's not quite the sense that this experience is something that will refine you as a person. Now, it's also very important to understand that although love is seen to be ennobling or refining, it is not understood in some allegorical, Platonic sense, philosophical sense. Okay? It is understood as erotic passion, very much so. I think this is something you'll see in the poetry that we look at tonight. We're going to look at 6 examples tonight that I hope should make that clear. Now, this is against the grain of, for example, a well-known tradition in both the Christian and Jewish traditions, namely the Shir HaShirim, or the Song of Songs. This is a very erotic poem. If you ever heard it read at a wedding, you know, it's really hot stuff. But the most religious people in Europe actually read this without blushing because they understood it allegorically. In the Christian tradition, it represents Christ's love of the church. And so the bride is figured as the church, and everyone sort of reads between the lines, you might say. And in the Jewish tradition, it's God's love of Israel. And in fact, to this day, in the Siddur, or the traditional prayer book, Hebrew prayer book, you'll find that on Fridays it's read as a sort of allegory of Israel's welcoming the Sabbath, the coming of the Sabbath as a bride. So there's that long tradition of allegorical reading, and that's not operating here. What we get is naked passion, essentially, and not understood in any kind of refined way. And I can illustrate that further by a reference to something called sometimes the ladder of love. These are stages of development in your course as a lover. All right? The first stage, you are a feñador. That literally means a faker, someone who dissembles his feeling because you're too timid to tell this woman you're in love with her. But if you suddenly screw up your courage and decide you're going to do this, you become a pregador, which means a supplicant, someone who begs her, again, often through the writing of poetry. Have mercy on me, I desire you. Strange little way of saying it, isn't it? If she decides that you're not just a loser and she wants to entertain your suit, you might say, although she, again, you're not really asking to marry her, she might give you some token, she might give you some sign that you are now going from being a supplicant to being a contender, you might say. Entendedor means, again, someone who's a sort of tolerated lover. And lastly, if you are so lucky to be invited to her bed and you consummate this relationship, you become a drutz, which is a consummated lover. Again, you've done it with her. Now, the thing about this is there is no next step. There is no step where then you come to recognize some higher reality in a Platonic way and you realize, oh, carnal love, that's just a stage. Not at all. It ends there. And that's important to see again. Now, other notions that are fundamental to this is, first of all, that this is primarily adulterous love. The beloved is someone who is married. And some people would call that a structural necessity. That is to say, marriage in the Middle Ages, especially in the aristocracy, and the higher you go, the worse this gets, is a business. It's not trying to look for happiness in your emotional plane, but rather how to create dynastic alliances, how to get larger and larger tracts of land together. So again, individual happiness or sentimental happiness of that sort is less of a concern. The other thing is, as much as it's always a scandal in the Christian tradition, since marriage is a sacrament, to commit adultery, it's an even worse scandal to corrupt a virgin. So the idea that there's an option, that is chasing after young unmarried girls, is not really there, especially in aristocratic circles. So you have to understand that. Now, in French literature, we do have examples of conjugal happiness, conjugal love, so don't get depressed about this. It's just that the model, especially in the South, tends to be one of adulterous love, and you just have to get used to that. And I might say it's a long French tradition. The other thing about this, though, is it's important structurally in the poetry because this means that as a married woman, she has a social status. She is a lady. She has property, power, privileges, and this is precisely one of the things that's most important about this because the entire love relationship is modeled on a feudal pattern. I'll get into that in a minute. But that's what makes her so lofty. Now, because of this, this is by necessity a poetry of discretion. You don't name names, idiot. So instead, in the love poetry, what you get is a code name called a señal, something that is transparently a code name too. Okay? And this is what makes it so mysterious. Now I have to tell you, there are documented adulterers in this group of poets, but there are also those who are playing with, again, the language of adultery who may not really be doing it. So you needn't think that this is a document of immorality or something simply because it's really about poetry. It's not necessarily about who you're getting in bed. Now, feudal language, as I said, is used to describe the relationship, and that's the most distinguishing feature of this in relation to other types of love poetry around the world from ancient Egypt through the Greco-Roman period or, again, the Arab love poetry of the 10th and 11th century. What do we mean by feudal notions? First of all, the lover takes a position of vassal to this lady, to this beloved, no matter who he is. Okay? Puts himself in an inferior position. She's referred to often as midons, which is masculine and means my lord, not my lady. So again, that's a recognition of a hierarchical relationship that is patterned after the feudal relationship that, again, many of these people have in their real lives with their liege lords. All right? And one of the interesting things is one of the prime words for erotic love is drudaria, which is a strange sounding word. Amor is also used. That I'm sure you'll recognize. This originally comes from this adjective drut that means strong, vigorous, or even valiant, and was used to describe, again, a particularly valiant vassal who now is being described as the lover. And druts then becomes the official word for lover. It's a very strange kind of perversion of this language for an erotic situation that you and I can both imagine. Well, at least I can. Now, one of the things that the vassal does regularly is to say that he is working for this lady in the sense of being a vassal performing love service, which can take various forms. But that means, too, that he's constantly asking for some reward for this love service. And that's a pattern common in feudal relationships. That is to say, if you are someone's vassal, you have your rights in this arrangement. In other words, your lord also has things that he must do for you. And again, in this love relationship, the way it's modeled, that's very much how it goes. The vassal, the lover, again, expects things if this is truly a relationship. We get a lot of aristocratic value terms that are, again, completely twisted in this poetry and used in new ways. They're very hard to translate, unfortunately. Prets, for example, originally means price or value and came to mean the good reputation of someone, but this now is put in an erotic context to mean, again, what makes the person someone you really want to love or fall in love with. Djinn, again, means noble, but can also mean beautiful. Again, sort of an aristocratic prejudice that if you're of noble blood, you're beautiful, therefore you are sexy. Balor, again, you think of valor, you think of bravery. This is, again, originally how we see these terms, and they become twisted in this case, again, to mean the value, again, that would make you want to love this person. And Joven means youth, except now it gets totally twisted in a way that's very hard to translate sometimes, to mean some kind of youthful vitality, springiness, loveliness that makes the person, again, so lovable and interesting. So all of this language is sort of being knocked askew. Lastly, most importantly, courtly love. Reflecting court, the culture of the aristocracy, not the clergy. Very important because, of course, the great circle, or I should say, context for literary activity in the Middle Ages is very often, again, the cathedral chapters, the universities, again, dominated by men, dominated by clergymen especially. So courtoisie is aristocratic fashion, a world of people interested in showing their power, their beauty, their wealth, and this is one of the sort of rather vainglorious things that this cult of love gets caught up in. You can read a lot of rather grumpy statements by clergymen who in fact deplore this trend in society. All right? What is the opposite of courtly? That which is vilain, that which is a peasant's worldview, a peasant's way of doing things, a peasant in appearance. Vilain originally means peasant. And in English, of course, to this day, you know what a villain is. It's a profoundly negative term. All that is anti-courtly is vilain. And we can look at this graphically as this. The world at large is made up of, as you can see here, my mouse comes out, yeah. The world at large is largely made up of ugly peasants. This is all the villainy that surrounds us. Then there's this inner circle of those who are courtly and refined. Those who have essentially, at the top level of society, reached a stage economically, socially, aesthetically of refinement. And in that, there's a smaller circle still of those who know true love, fin amour. Now, it's important that you realize you can be courtly and not love, but you cannot love without being courtly. So this, when we say courtly love, you need to understand in this logical relationship. Not only that, it is occasionally said that true love makes someone courtly. Someone who is vilain becomes cortés. And someone who is cortés by birth but does not love, tries to put impediments in the way of love, he can become vilain, even though he is a noble. So again, you can see a twisting of many of the value terms that originally have a sociological dimension. The last of my general descriptions before we get to the actual poetry. We call this a stylization of desire. That sounds fancy. What does it mean? Desire, first of all, is what love poetry is about. Not about sex. There'd be no difference between love poetry and pornography if that's really what it was about. It's about desire. It's about, again, this state where there is something that separates you from your beloved. So that is something that courtly love literature has in common with all erotic literature. But style, again, comes from its aristocratic foundation. Style in the sense of expression in the poetry as well as in the whole way of life. All right? And I'm going to show you some examples that should make that very clear. Now, you'll occasionally hear it said that this poetry represents the discovery of the individual. I'm sure you might have read something to that effect in one of the things you've been reading. Well, it's not entirely wrong. It depends on what you mean by an individual. I mean, if you mean an individual in the sense of, a modern sort of possessive individual, a consumer, or someone in a liberal democracy, it can be a rather misleading way of thinking about it because, first of all, the personalities expressed in this poetry are caught up in a very different social reality, that again of constant subservience, feudal relationships. So again, the idea of simply being free, as we say in America, isn't really there. It's all about bondage. I don't mean that in the way you probably mean it. It's a drama of the imperiled self, meaning, again, it's all about an expression of misery, of doubt, of worry. So again, you'll find very often if there's an individuality here, it's one that's precarious, one that's, in a sense, fraught with problems, not with triumphs. Deep formal play. Absolutely. Again, I mentioned the complexity of this poetry is bewildering. Absolutely. Astounding. Okay? And for that reason, you need to understand it in those terms. This is a form of play, and so it's not all sincere. It's not all records of real love affairs. It's a performance art. Again, it's not something people read. So part of the persona of the lover is a performing persona. Okay? Showing off. You'll see what I mean. It also represents the emergence of these secular courtly values, which have a certain narcissism in them. Again, and you'll see that very clearly in a minute when I look at some actual poems. And most importantly, it's an emergent set of alternative values, again, that are not the same as the feudal values from which they emerge, again, because being in love with your lord's wife, after all, puts you in a potential situation of conflict, right? If you were a good servant, you would not do that. But also, obviously, in direct contrast with the Christian values that the clergy are supposed to espouse, but as you probably have heard, did not always. Let's look at our first example. This is a poem by a poet by the name of Guiraud de Borneille, who lives 1162, 1199, somewhere in there. And this is a particular type of poem known as an alba. An alba, the word for dawn, literally, is a dawn song. And I chose this because it shows you a very direct contrast of values with some very important traditional Christian images. In the dawn song, there is a dramatic situation which is this poetry represents a moment when three people basically need to become aware that daylight is about to come. There is a loyal friend who's come to keep watch, while his friend the lover has a night of genuine erotic passion again, nothing platonic about it, with his beloved. And as dawn comes, of course, it means that they are potentially going to be exposed. So there is this dramatic kind of setting, and there is, again, at least three personae, although the poem I'll show only has two. The threats are, again, the impending daylight, the threat of a jealous husband coming to, again, catch them and perhaps kill them or something, as well as slanderers, those little brown-nosing backbiters who are always looking to get in good with their lord by reporting on the misdeeds of other people. Again, these are constant stock figures in this type of poetry who threaten the happiness of the lovers. Now, why is this weird? It totally reverses the traditional liturgical associations in the Church of what is dawn. Dawn is a very happy time in the Christian liturgy. It represents, for one thing, the discovery of God's goodness and glory through creation, that is simply seeing the world come to life. You realize God has made this world for you, and it's good. All right? That comes up a lot in early morning liturgy, as well as this whole series of associations of Jesus Christ as the light that was sent into the world through the incarnation. In the Gospel of John, that's very explicit. And the people chose darkness instead, and that's why everything is messed up. Okay? But Christ as light's very important, and you'll see at the beginning of this poem it comes out quite prominently. Also, it's the passing away of darkness, of danger, of evil, of devilry, of all the things that can happen in the night again. So the joy associated liturgically with dawn is here reversed. The lovers like darkness. You can get away with stuff, right? And dawn represents catastrophe for them. Their happiness is cast into peril. Now look at the beginning. This is the original Provençal, just to give you a feel for what it sounds like. Then I'll give you some rather uninteresting translations that I've made, because they're copyright free, but they do literally say what it says, okay? And it begins by talking to the Reis Glorios, the glorious king. Reis Glorios, verais lums eclartats, Deus poderos, Seigneur, se a vos plats, al meu campany si ats fizels ajuda, que eu no lo vi, pos la nox fu venguda, e ades serà l'alba. Glorious King, true light and brilliance, powerful God, Lord, if you please, to my comrade be a faithful aid, for I have not seen him since nightfall, and soon it will be dawn. And that's a refrain, and soon it will be dawn. Now, the beginning of this makes you feel as if this is a reference to Christ and might bring up these liturgical images, but then shockingly you find out, what's he praying for? Help my friend commit adultery, right? Dear comrade, he addresses his lover friend here. Are you asleep or awake? Sleep no longer, but gently arise, for I see in the east the star is risen which brings the day. I recognize it well, and soon it will be dawn. Dear comrade, I call you with my singing. Sleep no longer, for I hear that bird's song which goes about the trees in search of day, and I'm afraid the jealous man may attack you, and soon it will be dawn. Dear comrade, since I departed from you, I've not slept nor moved from off my knees, but I've prayed to God, the Son of Mary, that he may return you to me for our loyal friendship, and soon it will be dawn. Finally, the lover responds, Dear sweet comrade, I'm in such a perfect place that I would never want it to be dawn or day, because the loveliest of women ever born I hug and hold, and so I don't give a damn for that jealous fool or the coming dawn. And that's how the poem ends. Again, the dramatic setting, the lover doesn't care. Hang them all. Now, that gives you a sense of what utter contrast we have. There's nothing ironic in the way in which he invokes and prays to God here. That's what's strange about it, and rather disturbing, and that's precisely the riskiness about this poetry that makes it interesting. Now let's look at our second example, an example again of desire that's highly stylized. All right? This comes from the first and most important of our troubadours in the whole tradition, and it's a form called a canso that just means song. It's the great formal song form. William of Aquitaine, who lived 1071 to 1126. He's known in Provençal as Guillaume. He was the 7th Count of Poitiers and the 9th Duke of Aquitaine, and in fact was one of the most powerful nobles in all of France. So he represents the highest of the nobility. He's the first troubadour, as I said. There must have been something before him. It just doesn't survive. So this is why, when we talk about origins, we're so stumped. He was also a crusader, both in the Middle East and in Spain, which brings us to the question, What contact did he have with Arab culture? How might this have affected the growth of this poetry, since he is effectively the first one we see? He was excommunicated, in fact, for his adulterous love. Commonly, higher nobles were often excommunicated for various reasons, but his was specifically his insistence on carrying on a real relationship. So as I said, he's a documented adulterer. He was a great spontaneous performer. We hear this time and time again. Quite a show-off. Loved to do performances, again, to entertain his fellow nobles. And he's also the founder of one of the greatest literary dynasties in medieval France, as we'll see a little later, if I don't run out of time. Now, here's a song, and again has a very conventional opening, and I'll read it to you first in the original and then the translation. Abla dolcior del temps novel, foil de libosc, il aut cel chanton, ciascus en lor lati segon lo vers del novel chan. Adonc sta ben che om saisi da ciò don toma plus talan. With the sweetness of the new season, the woods are in leaf and the birds sing each in his own idiom, literally each in his own Latin, he says, according to the melody of the new song. And so it's right that each man takes pleasure in that for which he's the greatest desire. Now, there's a natural image here, isn't there? Desire is a natural thing. It's spring, all things desire, so naturally I too desire. And that's a common beginning, one of the most common beginnings for a poem in Old Provençal. Now he continues, from that place to where I'm most inclined, I see no messenger or letter coming. We infer this must be where his beloved is. And so my heart neither sleeps nor laughs, nor do I dare go on at all until I know whether in the end it will be as I ask. Again, this is a moment of tension, of uncertainty. Our love goes along just like the branch of a hawthorn, which trembles on the tree at night through ice and rain, until the next day when the sun comes out to touch the green leaves on the branch. Again, a natural image to give you a sense that there's some sort of vicissitude, constant change in this. I still remember well one morning when we made peace and stopped the war, and she gave me a gift so great, her faithful love, her drudaria, he says, and her ring. May God let me live still long enough so I may get my hands under her cloak. Now, some people interpret that last bit as maybe a reference to a feudal gesture, that is a gesture of vassalage, where someone has a mantle is often used, or a cloak, to represent protection, in a sort of gesture. But obviously, the reason why you laughed is it has an obscene meaning, and in fact many of his poems have this tendency to suddenly fall into this kind of obscenity. This is the last bit called the envoi, the final stanza. I don't care that strange language separates me from my good neighbor. Now that is a señal. Good neighbor is his code name for his beloved. Because I know how words get out with a brief message that goes around, let others go bragging about their loves. We have the peace and the knife, which is a proverb that means we got it all, baby. That is, we have all we need. All right? Again, there's the sense that there's a world full of people who constantly talk, who are dangerous, who mess things up. Our love goes on and off, but really when you get down to it, we've got it all. Now that's highly stylized with natural imagery, and that's again precisely what I mean when I say a stylization of desire. Now, let's look at a master stylist of desire. This is Bernard de Ventadorn. He is one of the greatest of all time love poets. And he lived somewhere between 1147 and 1170. And this is one of his most famous poems, which has a haunting... actually, this has a nice melody, but there's another that has a beautiful melody that I'll talk about in a minute. I moved the order of these. This one, again, shows you a contrast with natural imagery. Lo temps vai e venne vire. Listen to that alliteration. Lo temps vai e venne vire, per giorns, per mesi, per ans. E eo las, non sai che dire, c'ades es us mostalans. Ades es us en nos muda. Cuna in vol in ai volguda, don anc non aic cimen. Time comes and goes and returns in days and months and years, and I, wretch, don't know what to say, for my desire is always the same. It's always the same and doesn't change because I love and have loved only one woman with whom I've never once had fulfillment. And you know what he means there, I hope. A later stanza, again, speaks to her in very direct terms. Listen to the particular melody of the music, essentially, of the poetry. Ai bon amor sin covida, cors be fights del gazzi plas, fresca cara colorida, qui Deus formet absas mas. Tots temps vosai desirada, que res autra non m'agrada, autra amor non vol nien. Ah, my longed-for love, well-built body, slim and trim, fresh rosy face, which God formed with his hands. I've always desired you, and no other thing can please me. I want no other love. All right? Again, notice, God the Creator. You're one of his great creations, baby. Right? That is a religious sort of reference, but not done ironically. And this is the last bit, the envoi. Sweet, well-brought-up creature. Again, he calls her enseñada. She is refined. She is courtly. May he who formed you to be so comely grant me that pleasure which I await from you. Again, I think you know what he means. Now, let's come to another poem, this by Bernardo Ventadona again, that shows us the narcissism I've been talking about. And this is the one I was telling you has one of the most beautiful melodies in all medieval literature. And it begins again with a reference to him looking at a bird who enjoys himself. Again, let me just give you the first stanza so you get some sense of what it sounds like. Because you never are going to hear Provençal, except maybe tonight, unless you go over there to France. Can vela l'auceta mover de joy sas alas contra el rai, qui s'oblides laisa chautser per la doçor calcor li vai. Ai, tan grans inveia m'invei, de cui cio veia jauzion, meraviglia sai, car de se, lo cor de desirer non fon. Whenever I see the lark move its wings for joy against the rays of light, and forget itself in a deep free fall for the sweetness that runs to its heart, ah, such an envy comes upon me of whatever I see enjoying itself. That I'm amazed from all of this, my heart doesn't melt with desire. What a wonderful image. He's sitting and watching this bird and just has to envy the fact that the bird so simply lives fully his desire and his happiness. I've had no power over myself, a later stanza says, nor been my own man from that moment on when she let me look into her eyes in a mirror that greatly pleased me. Mirror, since I saw myself in you, deep sighs have killed me, and I've lost myself just as in the pond fair Narcissus too was lost. Now Narcissus is a figure from Roman mythology, Greek and Roman mythology, through Ovid especially here, who is this young beautiful boy who everyone loved, but essentially would consent to love no one. And so he was punished by falling in love with himself, seeing his reflection in a pond, and then he dwindled into the narcissus flower. He was transformed, which is why it's in Ovid's Metamorphoses. And this figure of Narcissus comes up time and time again in this poetry. So you think about it, it's rather interesting, isn't it? Again, it's a poetry of all about the desire to desire, the loving being in love. And there's something inherently narcissistic in the psychological sort of modern sense in that. Now, a fifth example, going back to William of Aquitaine, the idea that love makes you a better person. Again, you're talking about a poem written by the most powerful, one of the most powerful men in France. And these are a few stanzas isolated from his poetry that I just always have found striking for a man as powerful as he is to be saying. No one will be completely loyal to love unless he submits to it. Again, this is a discipline, a submission, a vassalage. And unless he is obliging to both strangers and his neighbors and obedient to all those people. Who wishes to love must display obedience to many people, and it behooves him to know how to perform decorous acts, to be courtly, right? And to guard himself from speaking in court like a peasant, villanaments. Again, the idea that refinement is a part of the process of love. Now, enough refinement. Let's get nasty. There's another side to fin amour. The other side of fin amour is also represented by the very same poets who write the sublime, wonderful poetry of stylized desire. And this is less stylized and rather nasty. Now, let me just give you an example. There are songs about sexual protocol, for example, that weren't published until the 1960s, many of them, because they were so nasty. One of which is a debate poem about whether it is proper for you, as a male lover, to perform oral sex on your beloved. And they go through various arguments, pro and con, which unfortunately is a terrible dirty pun in French, but I'm not going to go into that. Songs of seduction and even the rape of a peasant girl. Again, all of the poetry you've seen has been about being in love with this woman who is some kind of woman on a pedestal, social superior. In fact, there's a very well-represented genre called the pastorella, or the pastourelle in French, which is a song of an encounter, a knight traveling along through the fields. He runs into a peasant girl, and he begins to try to seduce her. And they trade off stanzas where he says things that are very flattering, and she counters back with, "Oh, I'm kidding." Now, usually she says things like, "I know very well you men have just one thing on your mind," right? Now, these have various outcomes. Sometimes the girl wins. She gets the better of him and he's made a fool of. Other times, he basically rapes her. So you have to understand that, again, in terms of the formal genres, these are taken and anything can happen in them. You can take the genres and do what you like. But that is a very different relationship being expressed, a very different kind of desire. They're songs of sexual prowess, a very male thing to do, no doubt. Singing songs about how great you are. This is something we're about to see. A gap, a brag is what gap means. There are songs which also parody love songs. They make fun of all of the things that conventionally are said in love songs and say, oh, I'm just so miserable, trying to make fun of the whole idea of this. Again, you would expect that in any highly formalized poetic tradition that there would somewhere exist parody, because it is very formalized, and especially the more things are repeated, the more prone they are to parody. There's songs defaming women instead of, again, idealizing them. And then there are these fascinating songs of ill-married wives, mal mariées as they're called in French. These are women who basically, or rather I should say, these are the voices that male poets often create for women, who sing about how their husband is an ogre, he beats her, and she doesn't know why, she only has 2 lovers, that's no big deal. There's a comic sort of aspect to this. We don't find spousal abuse amusing, but again, this is a kind of knockabout humor, a farcical kind of thing that comes through, and it's also another well-represented lyric genre. Now, let's look at an example of a gap, looking at the seamy side of courtly love. This is a bragging poem, you might say. This is by William of Aquitaine. Again, what's weird is this first troubadour gives us everything already in the first generation. Sublime love poetry and some nasty things too. Now, it starts off in this very playful mood. I'll make a song since I'm sleepy and wandering about, taking in the sun. There are women of wicked intention, and I know which ones. Those who take a night's love and turn it to no good, he says. A lady commits no mortal sin who loves a loyal knight. But if she loves a monk or a clerk, she's wrong. One ought rightly to burn her with fire tongs. Now, it's not that he's shocked that these people would be seduced into breaking their holy orders, but rather that, in fact, they are the competition. And that's something that you'll see if you know William of Aquitaine's personality. How do we know this? Well, in part, the thing about the poem is he then describes about how he went on pilgrimage, dressed as a pilgrim. All right? Gives us a religious sort of setting. And he ran into these 2 women. In fact, they are married women, and he calls them by their husbands' names. And they say, hello, Mr. Pilgrim, how are you? And he responds by going, grr, grr, in other words, in unintelligible syllables. And they say, he's mute, how wonderful. Let's take him back to our place, because, of course, he can't tell anyone what he's doing. So they take him back, and they feed him, and they feast him, and they make him feel very happy and warm. Then they say, well, he might be able to speak. He might be trying to fool us. Let's test him. So they strip him naked, and they get this big cat with huge claws, and they scrape it down the back of his naked shoulders. And it's described as a kind of mockery of a Christian martyrdom. What he has to go through. But he submits to this. He doesn't scream. And then he says, I stayed with them 8 days and more. And there's a sort of orgy that goes on. And this is one of the last things. He says, you will now hear how much I screwed them. Actually, he uses the Provençal equivalent of the F word, but I don't think we could do that on television. 188 times, such that I nearly broke my strap and my harness. And I can't tell you how weak the whole thing made me. And then the last stanzas, he says to this fellow who's carrying his poem, he says, go to Mrs. So-and-so and Mrs. So-and-so, and please, on my part, will you tell them, kill the cat? Now, we are now at the very end of this section, and I want us to consider the question of origins. This terribly rich poetic tradition appears seemingly as if it landed from the moon. Or does it? That's the big question, and there are no easy answers. The first question is, what is the relationship between this 12th century love poetry in the south of France and the great 11th century love poetry in Arabic Spain and Al-Andalus? Especially when you consider that one of the dynamic changes that Europe undergoes that makes the 12th century Renaissance, as it's sometimes called, so dynamic is the experience of the Crusades, the contact with Arab culture. Well, this is a rather complicated thing, but the theory is essentially that somehow, again, in part through captive musicians, in part through time in Spain, they come to see the role of court poets in the Arab culture of Al-Andalus, and they decide they want that. And there are certain similarities that are interesting in terms of verse structure, in terms of motifs, using a bird as a messenger, for example, or a guardian who keeps watch on a woman. There are motifs that they have in common, and that certainly makes us wonder. And I think it's safe to say at some level there's definitely contact and an inspiration. However, it would be wrong to say that this Southern French poetry is simply a translation or an adaptation, whole hog, if you will, of an Arab tradition. Why? Well, partly because there's the enormous linguistic barrier. It's very difficult, essentially, for someone who speaks one of the Rodant's languages just to pick up Arabic. The opportunities are not really there. So for those who are even in Spain, again, that just being there for a little while is not necessarily going to make them suddenly fluent in Arabic. The other problem is musically. Again, the idea of this as song is very important because, in point of fact, the music of this song, all of the French song, I mean, conforms to what we would expect for Western music, not Arab music. Again, the maqam system of Arab, the modalities of Arab music are very different. So one of the things that's very noticeable is the melodies here sound Western. So that's one of the things that one would have to point out. Also, they're not mentioned. There's no mention of Arab poets. There's no desire to draw any link to them. That should make us a little suspicious. So there's some kind of influence, but it's hard to gauge. Roman love poetry is definitely an influence, especially through Ovid. And sometimes this whole courtly love phenomenon is called Ovid misunderstood. That is, Ovid wrote A Great Art of Love, a poem that is obviously a joke. I mean, it climaxes with a discussion of female orgasm. That's obviously trying to be funny, right? And there is a lot of Roman love poetry that is still read, especially in clerical circles, those who read Latin, believe it or not. They're reading the naughty bits of Ovid in the monastery and understanding it too. And you can see through the use of the myth of Narcissus and other figures that obviously it permeates to some degree, even into the vernacular poetry. But is this the cause? How suddenly could this be the cause? And one of the things that's most difficult is the feudal structure of the love relationship is totally unlike the Roman situation. All right? And the idea that love refines you, again, is something that really doesn't filter through Roman sources. Another interesting idea is this idealization of woman might be related to the cult of the Virgin Mary, which again grows as the Middle Ages creep along, especially at the popular level, but also again among the higher nobility. Mariolatry, we call it. Well, obviously the poetry I just read you does not sound like something you would think ought to be associated with the Virgin Mary, who is, after all, the Virgin Mary, right? And this is one of the biggest problems. If you read this poetry, especially the Southern French variety of it, you have to say, it's analogous, maybe, but really can't be seen causally related. Now, there is a way in which they're connected. The dangerous, almost blasphemous aspect of the Southern French poetry, when it's imported to Northern France or to Spain, often is resolved in lovely songs in the courtly mode, but that are structured as songs to the Virgin Mary. So, for example, Alfonso X writes this huge collection, or has a commission, of Cantigas de Santa Maria. These are songs written to the Virgin Mary, again, that adopt in some way courtly modalities. Or in the north, you'll find a number of poets who specialize in this songs to the Virgin, which again take the forms and some of the language, but very transparently adapt it for the Virgin Mary. There's no possibility of confusion. So the connections that are there are not necessarily causal, even though, again, there obviously is a way in which these two things can be put together. Did you have a question?
Were these songs for asking for forgiveness of what they've done, or just in comparison and expressing love?
Very good point. Tend to be much more devotional. Just, I love you. You're the Virgin Mary, and you make me happy. That kind of thing. However, one of the great love collections of the 14th century, Petrarch's poems, they are structured actually as a kind of palinode. That is to say, begins by saying, this is my tale of my being in love and my worldly wandering and mistakes I made. And in the last poem is a hymn to the Virgin Mary, which is very much making you feel like he's trying to make up for his amorous past, trying to be a good boy now. Let's move on. Another interesting suggestion is perhaps heresy is behind this love poetry, which is so blasphemous to begin with. Well, that's rather difficult if you know the details of the particular heresy that was prevalent in the South and was the cause of the Albigensian Crusade. Catharism is a bizarre and rather priggish religion. It's an extremely dualistic one in which the material world is seen as inherently deeply evil including the human body. Now, if you read the poetry, you don't really get a sense of that. You feel a celebration of the body, of being in a body and doing things with your body and seeing nature, and you don't really feel that this is infused with any sense of, again, evil. We've come back to one of the oldest hypotheses, which this is a spontaneous expression of the folk, of the people, and this was sort of the romantic paradigm. It was dumped for a while in the interest of other things, but it's come back. The point of fact is, since at least as early as I think the 10th or 9th century even, there's well-known folk poetry that has refrains that often has very simple structure, etc. It's related to a round dance. That might have been the original base for this. And what would happen then is it would be built up from a folk base and made a courtly poetry in part by following other models. Of course, writing is important because what we're talking about here in origin would be oral. But perhaps the Arab model, perhaps, again, Roman ideas. All of this comes together. In other words, we don't have to isolate one cause. One thing we can say, and this goes for heresy as well, it is the expression of proud and independent secular courts, relatively free of ecclesiastical control. That's the condition of southern France. Okay? And that would explain why this rather blasphemous love poetry can flourish, as well as heresy. The independence, again, of these courts would have the possibility to foster both. They don't have to be causally related. All right. Let's move north for the end of this. I think we can do this. In the north, in the land of the langue ville, the language of oui, we have the first troubadours. They're the equivalent of the troubadours in the northern tradition, known by name sometime 1160 or 1170 again, within the same century, a couple of decades later. And in fact, William of Aquitaine, as I said, is the founder of a great literary dynasty. This is important to know. His granddaughter is one of the most fascinating women in all of history, I think. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Boy, if I could go back in time, I would like to party with her. She was an interesting, dynamic woman who was his heiress to the Duchy of Aquitaine, which meant she was also extremely valuable, and she became, through marriage to Louis VII, Queen of France. He loved her. Unfortunately, she scandalized him. And after a long marriage, finally he had it annulled in 1152, after she rather misbehaved, of all places, on crusade. And she hooks up later with a fellow named Henry, who happens to be Duke of Normandy, and lands on her feet because 2 years later he happens to become King of England, Henry II of England, one of the greatest of English kings. So, as you can see, she is no slouch. And with her, as she goes about, she brings the culture of Aquitaine, the southern singers like Bernard de Ventadorn, whom we've just seen. We've seen some of his poetry. So this is a causal connection to the spread of this north, like some sort of great amorous disease. She has daughters by Louis VII, Marie, who becomes the Countess of Champagne, and Elise, the Countess of Blois. These two daughters, again, hold very important literary cults. And when I say this is a literary dynasty, you see we shift from a kind of paradigm of production, which is William, again, who the grandfather actually wrote the poetry, to a paradigm of patronage, or since they're all women, sometimes we refer to it as matronage, that is sponsoring the poets and the poetry. Now, let's look at one text. You have actually this in your, parts of this at least, in your packet on page 48 and 49. There's a very weird text by a fellow by the name of Andreas Capellanus, which simply means André the chaplain, who is associated also with the court of Marie de Champagne and her mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. It's a Latin treatise on love. It's a very weird text. It's a weird text because it's an amalgam of various things. It's didactic, it wants to teach like a scientific treatise. It's rhetorical, it's very interested in how people must speak if they're lovers. It's sociological because it goes through an enormous range of social situations. How do peasants talk to another when they're in love, and all of this kind of thing? How do kings? It's very bizarre. It's also legalistic in that there are all kinds of rules and court cases that are settled about love. So it's a bizarre collection of things. There's even a kind of Breton story in it, like King Arthur almost. If you look on page 49, for example, there's this definition given of love at the very beginning. Love is a certain inborn suffering derived from the sight of and excessive meditation upon the beauty of the opposite sex, which causes each one to wish above all things the embraces of the other, and by common desire to carry out all of love's precepts, wink wink, in the other's embrace. Now, again, this is a strange text because if it's written in Latin, it's written by someone, again, of clerical vocation, someone, again, who's in orders. And what's strange about it is it's addressed to this fellow Walter, who's supposedly going to learn valuable lessons from this thing. And in the end, he's trying to dissuade him from love. As a text, it's very bizarre. But it is one of our first and most important arts of love. And you'll see also on page 48, I won't go into it because I want to get through this, but there are the rules of love. So you can see, again, a kind of legalistic fascination with the kind of 10, or it looks like about 35 commandments that you need to master. A later art of love in the northern French tradition becomes one of the greatest masterpieces of the Middle Ages. And in fact, it's translated by people like Geoffrey Chaucer in England, maybe even Dante. It's one of the greatest hits. It's the Roman de la Rose, the Romance of the Rose, an allegorical art of love, the first part of which, at least, is all built around in this structure of a personification allegory. That is, various abstract principles are agents in this poem. These are courtly virtues and vices like leisure, courtliness, as well as erotic ones, sweet looks, wink wink, youth. Again, these are all these figures in the poem that come and greet this young lover who's led into this garden, who sees the fountain of Narcissus, who is then led to fall in love with this sublime vision of a rose. Unfortunately, it ends before we get to, that is to say, the poet died before he finished it, so that we don't really know how it ends. It's in its structure originally a bit between epic and romance, which I'll talk about in a minute. It was later finished, later in the 13th century, by another poet who did totally different things with it. It's so long that I'm probably the only one who's ever read it. But he ends with this, after long discussions about women and how nasty they can be and all sorts of philosophical digressions, he ends with the defloration of the rose. So you can see the second half is rather different in tenor. But the Romance of the Rose, I can't really say much more than read it, the first half at least, if you really want to get a sense for the full-blown culture of courtly love. Lastly, I'm going to briefly say a few things about narrative. Narrative, stories about love as opposed to poems. Marie de France is a very important woman writer of the Middle Ages. Beautiful, beautiful narrative poems called lays. No pun intended, that just means a song, apparently, a narrative song in the Breton tradition, and much of her material, in fact, comes from Brittany. Again, the Celtic French. Wonderful short stories that describe situations of lovers, but also other things that are rather folkloric. For example, there's a werewolf story about a man who turns into a werewolf, and he confesses this to his wife. I just can't help it, I turn into a werewolf. And she is so horrified, she conspires to make it so he stays a werewolf, and then he gets his revenge. So that obviously sounds like a kind of folk tale. These are fascinating short narrative poems, and I highly recommend them. One of the things that's interesting, by the way, is Marie de France knew English, and she was writing in England, and so we see a multiculturalism, a linguistic complexity in her work. She makes reference to English words, Breton words, and again, obviously writing in French. Lastly, we come to someone I should have begun with, one of the greatest writers of all time, Chrétien de Troyes. He is the founder of, really, the Arthurian courtly romance. He takes this world of King Arthur, which did not, in essence or in its origin, have much to do with courtly love, and he creates out of the world of King Arthur a context for various problems that are worked out about courtly love. His work is so important that you need to understand within a generation it's an international success. It leads to the writing of courtly romances in Germany and many other places. So he's one of the great figures of all time. The Arthurian vogue doesn't begin with him, but the particular way in which it will be worked out for the rest of especially the 13th century is very much deeply indebted to him, including the story of Percival. Some of you might know about this. Again, it's a combination of courtly love with a sort of chivalric utopia that is the never land of Arthur's court. Arthur, again, is the context in which certain crises develop. He's not really a protagonist most of the time. The epic hero that we see in early French epic poetry, the chanson de geste as it's known, is transformed into a lover hero whose great tasks are knightly. They involve fighting. They involve all kinds of adventures of a perilous bodily sort. But they are also centered around loving. And interestingly, women have a huge role in these narratives. They are facilitators. They are the objects of desire. They are sources of wisdom. Whereas in the epic tradition, the martial epic tradition, women are largely objects and really only are referred to every now and then. Roland's, for example, girlfriend, her only appearance is to find out that he has died, and then she says, "Oh my," and drops dead. That's it for her. So again, the whole courtly romance tradition leads to a much more interesting representation of women. Now, again, what these work through are various problems of love service and in conflict with chivalry. Some of them are conjugal in nature. In fact, Eric and Enid, one of his most interesting stories, is a couple that goes out on adventure because after they get married, they're so happy that Eric's knightly prowess is called into question. So again, it's not necessarily adulterous for Chrétien, and his one great romance that is adulterous, one that involves Lancelot and Guinevere, I'm sure you've seen the movie about that. That is something that he appears not to have liked because he didn't finish it. Someone else had to finish it. So I should have or could have done a lecture on all this that I just crammed through in the last 5 minutes. But that just goes to show again that what begins in the south of France as scrappy lyric poetry of a fascinating sort branches out into all kinds of literature, and courtly love again becomes Europe's great literary disease. Thank you. Any questions? We have about 43 seconds. Commercials? Okay.